This mini lecture is on fundamentalism. As you hopefully know already from reading our course packet, fundamentalism began as a particular movement within Christianity in the United States in the 19 teens. There were some wealthy conservative Christian businessmen who put out some tracts that they disseminated across the country saying that there were certain fundamentals of the Christian faith that had to be upheld, fundamentals that needed to be upheld in the face of modern challenges, challenges of modern culture to traditional Christian faith. Fundamentalists would say that the Bible is without error and that basically everything needs to be interpreted literally. At least unless it's something obviously metaphorical, like when uh, Jesus calls Herod that fox. But everything in the Bible is historically true or accurate, scientifically accurate, not just religiously true. So scholars have taken this term fundamentalism and applied it outside of Christianity more widely to any religion where you have folks who do take their scripture in this inerrant, literal kind of way. Now, scholars would typically say that not, not that among all of these fundamentalists, none of them actually take all of their scripture literally. Not that they're conscious of this, but unconsciously they read some passages that literally would not really accord with their overall way of looking at reality and just kind of subconsciously read them less literally and read those that kind of fit into their overall worldview and their view of Christian faith in a literal way. Scholars also typically hold that any scripture passage, that when it's read by anyone, is interpreted. We bring something to the scripture, whoever we are. So all scripture is interpreted. Fundamentalists would disagree with that in the sense that they would say, well, there's no interpretation needed. It's obvious what God or whatever the divine source of my scripture is means by this or meant by this. Many scholars also have noted that though fundamentalism speaks up in the name of tradition against modern challenges to tradition, fundamentalists actually tend to be rather cut off from the history of tradition within their own faith community. They kind of come more individually to their scripture now in light of present culture and challenges to the Christian faith, and rather selectively pick certain passages and ways to interpret those passages that often do not have very much, if any, continuity with the larger historical tradition of interpreting the Bible or whatever their scripture might be. So, a little scholarly background on fundamentalism. Now, the main thing I'll be getting into, and this will bring in some discussions from various classes of introduction to religious thought over the years that I have taught. And it'll bring in some things that should be pretty much clear or pretty much out there from your readings, your pro fundamentalism under the name of Jerry Falwell, probably more ghost written by someone else, and then the con against fundamentalism by Evans and Brent. But let's kind of do this broad overview of pro and con for fundamentalism. So those who are fundamentalists, or those who at least would defend it or try to give it credit, explain it in its own best light, what are some of the advantages of fundamentalism? Well, if you are a fundamentalist, you could say, a fundamental security. Your faith tells you that you have an absolutely secure authority, an authority that is free from any error. Another argument would be that fundamentalism makes it simple. Others may disagree, but the fundamentalists would say it makes it simple or relatively simple to interpret Scripture, because you don't have to really pick and choose which passages to take literally, which ones to take symbolically. Of course, a third argument would go back to the initial impetus, the initial understanding of those who started the fundamentalist movement, that they believe they are guaranteeing the tradition, right? Securing the tradition against challenges, against doubts. So they would say the basics of the faith should never be given up, and we're the ones who are holding on to those fundamentals, those basics. Also, a fundamentalist, number 4, might say that fundamentalism involves in its very nature a strong commitment to the faith. If you're taking it literally as inerrant, and you're, at least if you're halfway serious about that, you're going to be committed to your faith, whether it be Christian fundamentalist faith or Islamic or Jewish or Hindu. At least for those who believe that a personal God has inspired Scripture to be inerrant, you would say, well, how can I be so sure that this is true, even if it seems to contradict some historical discovery or some scientific discovery or the consensus of science? Well, God guarantees the Bible. So even though the humans who wrote the Bible were imperfect and fallible, subject to error, God made sure that they would make no mistakes at all. Number 6, and this one admits that, well, yeah, we can find some errors in the Bible, but a defense for some fundamentalists would be that in what they call the original manuscripts, there were no errors. And so, as scribes copied the Bible down through the decades and the centuries, a few errors may well or did creep in. Wrong copying, but not wrong inspiration, original inspiration from God, who intended it and delivered it as lacking any error whatsoever. Another would be to say that this would be number 7, I think, if anyone's counting, that the fundamentalist position is a humble one. If I'm a fundamentalist, I'm just accepting it on faith. I'm humbling myself before God and not trying to get too complicated in my thinking, my questioning of things. I'm just a humble believer. Now, there's one other argument, but it probably doesn't quite fit under the fundamentalist category. It would kind of admit, well, there may be minor errors, and even not just minor errors that crept in through the copying process down through the ages, but even in the initial writing of the Bible, God inspired folks to be amazingly consistent overall, uh, despite some minor errors. So it's kind of not quite, it's a kind of a fundamentalism light defense there on that last point. All right, what about the con side? And there's somewhat more in numbers, at least, that have come to my attention anyway over the decades now of teaching. Number one is that, and Evans and Brent definitely say this, that God respects our human autonomy, our human nature, our own thinking, ways of understanding, ways of doing things. So even though we are imperfect, God respects our integrity and respects our dignity as human beings. So God would not override human beings if they uh, in terms of maybe modern science, but someone in the ancient world understood the world in the way everyone did back then. God would not override the knowledge or presumed knowledge and integrity, dignity of people who wrote Scripture. Number two would be the claim that there are many contradictions within the Bible. And we don't have to go into too many details. I'll just mention that some would point out that if we take the two creation stories, there's Genesis 1, there's Genesis 2, if you take each of those very literally, they don't totally stack up against each other. There are some definite contradictions there. Could also point to some differences, indeed some contradictions between the resurrection stories, the four different resurrection stories of Jesus in the four Gospels. So the cons would say there definitely are some contradictions, whether or not you consider them major or minor. A third point would be that not only the contradictions within some parts of the Bible, um, but there's other evidence, that historical evidence, that indicates that some parts of the Bible are historically inaccurate. I won't go into any details there. Also, and this is fairly obvious, the fourth argument would be that various details in the Bible, if taken literally, go against the consensus of modern science as to how old the world is, as to how human beings got here, again, if taken literally. Number five, uh, we saw a pro argument was that fundamentalism makes interpreting the Bible simple. Well, the con would kind of take that but say too simple. It's simplistic. That's what simplistic means, being too simple. A sixth objection would be that the approach tends to be narrow-minded and intolerant of other interpretations. If it's inerrant and I think I have the right interpretation, that might lead or lend to intolerance. And some have even said that this tendency sometimes ends up causing some denominations, some religious leaders, some churches to be manipulative, to even be guilty of maybe some form of brainwashing, or at least some form of cultish activity, in the sense of being manipulative and trying to be too controlling of how their members think or behave. So I think we'd be up to number 8 now. And that would be that this fundamentalist approach could tend to overlook the religious meaning of a passage. And it might all come down to, well, did this thing about the Exodus actually happen? Well, if it didn't, then this passage is worthless. Well, what about the religious meaning that has inspired folks down through the ages, including slaves held in America, including Martin Luther King Jr., and so on? Uh, you know, if the fundamentalism kind of has this all or nothing sense, if any part of it is wrong, then it's no longer this absolute authority. So one, at least this criticism, this con point is that one could overlook the religious meaning, focusing on insignificant historical details. Another point would be that it can tend towards legalism, which is kind of maybe a little more specific of being narrow-minded, but focusing kind of on the letter of the law, and then being judgmental of those who don't follow the letter down to the last detail, the last iota. The con side also talks about how much of the Bible was passed down orally over decades, in the case of the New Testament within the Christian Bible, but over hundreds of years when it comes to the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. And oral, and generally scholars would say oral transmission does not render details over accurately over hundreds or even over decades. Earlier, I talked about how scholars generally agree that scriptures are open to interpretation. So, a con argument would be that, well, obviously scriptures, and especially some are more obvious than others, but scriptures are and have been open to differing interpretations, sometimes quite contradictory interpretations. A further point on that would be that um, in flexibility in interpretation is good, contrary to the position of fundamentalism, because times change, cultures change over time, and we really, if a scripture is really going to speak to us, whether we know it or not, we are going to be reinterpreting it in some way for our time, our own culture. Let's see if I've, and one final point would be that against fundamentalism would be that it discourages the religious believer or the prospective believer or someone who feels they could get some spiritual nourishment from the scripture of a religious tradition. It discourages that person from thinking for oneself. So those are some pros and cons. I'll invite you to respond to those, to think of maybe some other arguments for fundamentalism and or arguments against fundamentalism.